Hey everyone. So I have the pleasure of starting off this talk. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Nyman. She already introduced all of my colleagues, but this is Jenna, this is Lauren, this is April. They're all amazing, and I'm lucky to work with them. We are here presenting on the state of offshore wind development on the Texas Gulf Coast. This project was funded by the National Science Foundation. This is actually the end of our project on offshore wind. So we thank the NSF for bringing us here and for funding this research. Here we go. So quick overview of offshore wind in the Gulf. Really quick overview, it doesn't exist. Longer overview is that under our previous administration, the Biden-Harris administration decided that they were going to set goals for increasing offshore wind energy development in the United States. And as a part of that, in 2021, we had a number of lease sales off of the Gulf Coast in Texas and in Louisiana. And these lease sales, we had one bid on the Louisiana sales, none on the Texas. We're like, that's kind of strange. And then the idea was we'll have more lease sales coming up, and so we'll see greater growth in offshore wind in the Gulf. The purpose of our research is to understand the decision-making around the coastal energy transition by examining support for offshore wind development in the Gulf Coast. Now, we do this in three ways. The first is that we do a document analysis of newspaper articles published in the Galveston Daily News, as well as in the Houston Chronicle. So this is the major urban area. Galveston is part of the Houston metropolitan area that would be supplying these potential offshore sites and would potentially be using the energy from them. So that seemed like the best kind of examples that we could go for in terms of printed material. We also, as you heard a little bit from earlier, did some interviews with stakeholders, particularly concentrating on those fisheries, politics, things that were directly related to offshore wind development. And then we also did a public opinion survey, public acceptance survey for offshore wind for residents in the state of Texas. As the girls pointed out in their poster presentation, we use the technical innovative systems to kind of chronologically talk about like and code our work, looking at what we're doing. In this presentation, we're going to focus on legitimation because, well, quite frankly, it applies to everything. All of these other ones, also, you first have to have legitimation. So we're looking at policy, we're looking at public acceptance, and we're looking at the environment. Now, you might be wondering, okay, why Texas wind? Well, the fact of the matter is we don't have any offshore wind, but we do have a lot of onshore wind. In fact, Texas is a tremendous leader in onshore wind generation. We've had a robust wind energy industry in the west of Texas since the 1990s that is still going very strong. We are a huge producer of wind energy in the United States. We also have a very long history of offshore oil and gas production in the Gulf in Texas. And so the idea was we have these skill sets that we have developed both in wind and in offshore energy generation. Why are we not combining these things in order to take advantage of this?
All right, so what I'm going to talk about are the results of the public opinion survey that we did of Texas residents. So one of the first things we were interested in is how Texas residents understood the energy system in the state of Texas. And what we saw is a relatively high level of knowledge, or kind of what we would expect with that bell curve. So most 63% of Texans claim to be at least moderately informed about the state's energy system. We then asked folks, do you think the state of Texas should incentivize the production of particular energy types? And we were kind of surprised that most said yes. So 68% thought the state should incentivize energy production by source. And we were a little surprised. If you're familiar with Texas, they pride themselves on free market and strong private property rights. And so this kind of flies in the face of that. Now, of those folks who said yes, or maybe not, who are a little on the fence, we asked them, could you rank the type of energy that you would like the state of Texas to incentivize? And what you're seeing are the top 5 sources of energy that folks thought the state should be investing in. And as you see across those five, onshore and offshore wind ranks the highest. We then kind of pivoted because what we were really interested in was their thoughts on offshore wind and asked them, how aware are you of efforts to develop offshore wind in the Texas Gulf Coast? And perhaps not surprisingly, they weren't nearly as knowledgeable as they claimed to be about the energy system as a whole. And then we asked, based on your current understanding, what is your level of support or opposition for the development of offshore wind in the Texas Gulf Coast? And most, 71%, said they support it. And if you add those who say neither support nor oppose, we're hovering over 90%. So what we see is actually very little opposition. Now, we were interested in what folks were concerned about when it came to offshore wind. And so we asked them first about the economy. So thinking about the Texas Gulf Coast economy, please indicate the impact that you think offshore wind will have on each of the below items. And we found that half or more Texans thought offshore wind would benefit jobs, tax revenue, and port activity. And if we look at those items that folks were most concerned about, it would be fishing primarily, but that's really only 25% of the population. So we don't see a huge level of concern there. We then asked about the environment. And what we found was half or more Texans thought offshore wind would benefit climate change and air quality. And again, fish and marine mammals were among the top concerns. And then lastly, we asked about the energy system. And we found half or more Texans are quite optimistic about the potential impacts of offshore wind on the state energy system. So just as a takeaway, what we're really seeing is strong levels of support, with the greatest level of concern really being about fish and impacts to marine mammals.
So to kind of go a bit in depth with the environmental concerns, I conducted interviews with fishery stakeholders, and I was able to learn a bit more about some of their concerns. So for a bit of background, like Dr. Nyman mentioned, offshore oil and gas has been very prevalent in the Gulf of Mexico for the past 60 years. And what's really interesting is that the bases of these rigs act as artificial reefs and fish aggregating devices, though there is still research being done on whether these rigs actually produce the fish or if they just congregate them. But either way, you have this structure that brings fish in and it makes them easier for fishermen to catch. And so for decades now, the fishing industry in the Gulf of Mexico has really come to rely on these structures. But as of the last couple of years, some of the leases on those rigs have expired, and so their structures have been decommissioned and removed, and so has the artificial reef aspect. And then another concern that came up was a rapid decline in coastal migratory species like king mackerel, cobia, and Spanish mackerel. There has been a massive decline in their stocks, and it's not really known why, but there's some theories that it could be because of warmer water temperatures and also agricultural and nutrient runoff from the Brazos and Mississippi rivers. And I also learned that so in the Gulf of Mexico, we have a coral reef. It's about 180 miles offshore. And due to climate change and warming waters, whereas these corals used to be in like the upper limits of water temperature, the warming waters have now put our corals in the prime zone. And so corals in the Gulf of Mexico are actually, flourishing and expanding, which feels very wrong to say in the face of climate change. But that's also another incentive to really get these metal structures in the water, because there will be, really beneficial environmental benefits in the form of artificial reef restoration. And then another thing to point out is that in the Gulf of Mexico, most of the fishing is all hook and line, rod and reel. The only trawl fishing is the shrimping industry, and even then that's a struggling industry. And that's important because wherever you have a wind turbine, that is where trawl fishers cannot operate. And so when we were doing our research, that was one of the concerns that came up in the Northeast, is because they utilize a lot of trawl fishing, whether it's lobster, oyster, mussel. So when offshore wind came about there was a lot of pushback, but that's not really the same here in the Gulf of Mexico, where fishermen are really able to utilize these metal structures and artificial reefs. And so what was really interesting to learn is that a lot of these fishermen are very supportive of offshore wind. They see the economic benefit, they see the environmental benefit, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management also did a really good job of including them in the planning process. And so they routinely held meetings with fishing charter captains, industry stakeholders, to educate them about offshore wind and to, really educate them about the pros and cons. And so it was a collaborative effort to get these people together and work together. And then BOEM also utilized the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have a National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science branch, which essentially acts as like a data repository. And they were able to see which areas were being utilized in the Gulf of Mexico for fisheries or shrimping industries. And so they utilized that when they were planning these wind energy areas. And if you see right here, oh, the pointer isn't there, but the farthest most green block, you have these squares cut out. Those were cut out for the shrimping industry because they had extensive data that showed they utilized these waters for their business. And so the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management was able to set aside this area for them where wind turbines would not be placed, and so that their business wouldn't be affected. And lastly, one of the big things that came up was that because oil and gas rigs have been so prevalent, what offshore wind provides is the opportunity to, really restore some of this habitat and bring back in these artificial reefs that the fishing industry has really come to rely on for decades at this point.
So as I discussed earlier in the poster session, my focus was mostly interviewing and meeting with people in the political, economic, and energy sectors. And so I was essentially looking into like what the biggest socioeconomic hindrances offshore wind would face. And what we ran into is that the main issues is that this technology is hindered by kind of a lack of regulatory barriers and then ideological politicalization. So offshore wind essentially it struggles to gain the institutional foothold and support that oil and gas traditionally has in Texas. And so the biggest kind of sign of this is the state level advocacy and soft signaling. So state support is really important in a project like this. And we can look at Louisiana and see they put out originally this goal of having 5 gigawatts of offshore wind in the Gulf, which, although not enforceable, is a signal that that state will be supportive of this technology moving forward. It kind of helps shape that narrative early on, and then people see this as a legitimate technology. But unfortunately, in Texas, there's not that narrative. If anything, it's the opposite. Texas political leaders have had very hostile political signals and statements coming out about this technology. We have the Texas Land Commissioner who has openly opposed it. We have state senators that have openly opposed it. And this kind of actively undermines the legitimation of this technology. So it's a very strong signal to developers that people are not going to be able to buy this energy, and there is going to be no state subsidization of it. Because of this, there's also a lot of regulatory uncertainty. So if you are going to be, interested in purchasing one of these projects, there's a lot of confusion between what you're hearing from the federal and state governments. And so you're getting separate messages and you have this hesitancy before you invest. Additionally, there is kind of a conflict between this and oil and gas. And so with offshore wind lacking the institutional legal protections that benefit the oil and gas industry, it's more vulnerable to being shut down at different levels throughout the state. And so for this technology to be successful, it was brought up quite a few times that it would need some sort of legal protection going forward. And then a couple other things that were noted is that, unfortunately, again, a lot of green energy has become a polarized political issue, and it's difficult to get support bipartisan. And so it is something that they've realized needs to be framed not as a green issue, but an economic reasoning. So what they've found to be most effective is translating the economic benefits of a project like this. So focusing on the workforce benefit and not having to, not losing to other states in terms of energy. And so you want to make sure when you're speaking about a project like this to Texas lawmakers that you frame it in the way that our state is uniquely suited to be a leader in this technology.
And that brings me to our conclusion. Speaking of hostility. So literally in between the time that we submitted this talk and today, we had a change in administration. You might have heard about it. And one of the many, many, many executive orders that Trump issued in the first couple of days of his administration was one that basically killed offshore wind as a federal industry. That is to say, remember those lease sales I mentioned that were planned for the future? Nuh-uh. No, no more lease sales. The one that got bid on, as well as other parts of the country that had bids on leases, it's not clear yet, obviously, if that will be allowed to develop at all. They're still kind of thinking about that. I don't know. I can't predict the future. I'm not great at that. The ones that are currently in production are also potentially at risk. It's just not clear what the policy is going to look like, other than it is very anti-offshore wind at the moment. That having been said, since we are a bastion of positivity here, I would like to point out that you can still have state-run projects in state waters, which is why it's super important for us to focus on what different states incentivize and what people in different states feel are in their best economic interest, their best political interest. And frankly, given that Texas has had some problems with the continued working energy supply on our grid, just having access to the energy and having energy additions in terms of besides just the traditional fossil fuel industry. And so looking at these kinds of things, we think are actually going to become more important moving forward because of the federal hostility, because we're relying on states to kind of pick up that slack and potentially like kind of keep the offshore wind energy industry alive. Thank you very much.